me launch into just giving you a little bit of a history of myself, to just sort of get to the point. I mean, don't boo me until I put it all together in the end. So, basically I've been interested in the human mind since I was like 3-4 years old. I come from a family of mostly doctors and surgeons, so I was surrounded by medical books and libraries full of illustrations of the human anatomy. And one of the questions that really got me thinking is, how does all of this fascinating stuff beneath the skin, result in a living person? It just didn't make sense. It just didn't. And so this is something I would always ask my dad, and this is something that I would always ask my uncle, who's a heart surgeon. And they thought it was such a great question, but they didn't have a solid answer. And so that's something that drove me on this quest of being interested specifically in the human brain. And I thought for years that I was going to go into neurology and into medicine, and probably would be happy there as well. But then when I went through adolescence, I just started to have a couple of extraordinary experiences. I had, there were, as a child, I had like a few illnesses, that, were not lasting, but were intense enough at the time that, it put me into a very deeply feverish sort of place. And that's something that's always interested me, is how your mind and your perception shifts when you're experiencing a fever or experiencing, deep trauma, to the body. And so with that in mind, I had basically from the age of 5 to like 12 been very dedicated to the sciences and very dedicated to finding out everything that I could learn about, whether it be, black holes, the phenomena of dying stars, and what this all, trying to put this all together and make sense out of it. And then in adolescence, what I discovered was this sort of poetic mind, the mind that is both rational and irrational, that is both a dreamer and a builder, and and the kind of mind that is both tearing itself apart and constantly regenerating itself and building. And so I started to read a lot of stuff that was not biologically or scientifically related, but was more about this sort of poetic vision of the world. And when I was 16, I read an essay by Friedrich Nietzsche, because a class was canceled. And I went to the library and I just picked out a book because the author, I couldn't pronounce the author's name. So I just basically picked out that book and started reading it, and it was only 98 pages. And after I read that book, I realized that everything he was talking about in terms of art as it has been revered through the ages, had almost nothing to do with the kind of films, the kind of plays, the kind of stuff that I was looking at around me. And having grown up in New York City, I had access to all of that. And I just felt like this doesn't make sense. This is the most profound essay I've ever read. And I haven't seen anything that even comes close to this. Okay, so now we go to, it comes time for me to go to college, and I decide I don't want to go to college. I want to travel the world. And in my family, that just didn't fly. Very conservative family, and everybody just came down on me very hard. Because we had a friend of the family's that was in the shipping business, and I wanted to get a job on one of those ships. And I had this kind of like idea of just traveling the world and writing, and just seeing different people, different cultures, different languages, because I think that's what it's about, sharing and learning constantly. And so that was not something that was going to happen. So in making me apply to college, I decided as a rebellion that I was only going to apply to 2 schools, and I was going to make sure that those 2 schools I would probably not get into. So, so I applied to Columbia for pre-med with a minor in linguistics, and to the Film Conservatory at the State University of New York at Purchase. The Film Conservatory only took 14 kids out of 350, and I had never made a film. I had only written a ton of poetry and short stories. And I got interviewed to both and got into both. And it was just like that. I just felt eternally screwed by the universe. And it was really, and I just remember the moment too, like in the apartment. We lived on East 71st Street, and my mom and dad were so happy. They were on the phone calling everybody, and I just felt like, just leaping out the window. I remember just looking down at the street, 6 floors down, and just saying, it'll only take a few seconds. That's all, And so I really was incredibly, profoundly disappointed. So what I did is I deferred from Columbia and decided to try film. And I went to my first year there and made a 48-minute war movie where you have this kid who is coming home to see his family and is actually, and there's a great feast and preparation for him. And what you find out at the end is that he's really making his peace with all of his family members, because it's actually the moment that he gets killed that you're looking at. And it was a very ambitious project, and it was considered one of the best first films made at that school. So with that encouragement, because my parents were like, oh God, why are you going to film school? I mean, they just indulged that. But after that film, they just sort of said, this is pretty cool. This is good. And so they've been great supporters, ever since. And but the important thing here is that after making my first movie, I started to assemble a theater company of like artists, painters from different disciplines, sculptors, and I called that theater company Theater of Material, with the idea that I was oscillating between just pure atheism and the idea that everything is materially based, that the mind just comes out of the kind of explosion of synapses in the brain and the sort of electrochemical reactions in the head, and that's where life begins and where it ends, and that there is no there, and there's nothing really greater. Even though there was another part of me that was working underneath it all, trying to figure out and piece these things together. So that brought me to, I was 18 at the time, and then I was celebrating my birthday with one of my best friends, and instead of taking the subway, he said, let me drive you, up. We went up the West Side Highway and had a terrible auto accident. And in that accident, the engine had come through. It was a Le Car. I don't know if you remember those cars. It was a Le Car, and it was hit by an LTD, So it was just like the two opposites in extremes had come together. And so basically the car was situated at the side of the road. The engine had come through the dashboard, and I was wearing a seatbelt, but I was completely unconscious and not breathing. And my friend, who was pre-med at Columbia, kept me alive with mouth to mouth and whatever else he was doing. But the wonderful thing about this story is that I had the most profound experience of my life. I had this complete vision that took me through every single time in human history, and took me through the cosmos, through different religions with all of their figureheads, things I knew really nothing about. This is not, I was not reading about Buddhism, I was not reading about early Gnostic Christianity or anything like that, but there were things that I was seeing and that I was experiencing that were so deep and so that I could not ignore them. And after coming out of the accident without a scratch, I went into this like terrible depression for a few weeks. And in that depression, though, I wrote a lot of material. And one of the things I started getting into, which I didn't articulate as well at the time, but I articulated it better down the road. It was a feeling. It was like this feeling was almost impregnated into me, and it was like something that was kind of making its way out into creating an expression that needed to be expressed. And let me just try to read something that is actually going to make sense to you guys. All right, that there was basically this cosmology that I started to live with, that I was fascinated with. This idea that the base and the ground of all life and of all form is this like nothing, is this kind of abyss, this kind of like intelligent blackness that is constantly fighting and almost like almost if you imagine the most perfect watch going backwards and just tearing itself up. It's like this was the center of beneath everything. And that out of that is this kind of desire, this thrust, this yearning that gets thrust forward out of that. And in that thrust between the unmanifest and the manifest, there's this kind of primal terror that exists. And that primal terror became something that I was looking for in literature, looking for out in the world, and I just felt like it was not really addressed in anything that I was looking at. And there's also this idea that all form is really it's this idea of God sending himself out from this abyss and in the process knowing himself through the eyes and ears and nervous systems of each of us, that all of us are somehow, this idea that everything is one is actually something that is true. And this is something that fiercely grabbed my attention and focus at a very young age. And I really was grappling with these thoughts, the idea that, okay, if everyone is all looking at the same sunset, then there's this symphonic experience of the sunset if all those experiences are going towards that same center. And so, my God, I'm not going to do that again. So what this got me to thinking was that everything, that all form is actually somehow the decomposition of God. That as God sends forth, and I'm sorry I'm using the word God. I don't mean it in a, I just don't know what else, a higher power, whatever you want to insert in there, but I'm not trying to offend anybody. But this idea that this higher being is in fact insinuated into every cell, every electron, every part, every molecule of us and everything. And that it's almost like, you look at, and this is what made me think of the cinema in a different way. Because I started to look at the actual screen of the cinema, that screen right there, as a great symbol for reality. The idea that, you have this projection, that is this projection out, that is, this blinding light bulb that doesn't care whether good or evil passes in front of it, but it just happens. And then it's projected, if you project a fire, for example, on that screen, it's not going to burn the screen up. It's like there's this micro-thin layer between this reality and the illusion, and I'm getting a little abstract, so I'm going to try to move away from away from that for a second. But what it did was it inspired me enough, to just cut to the chase, to write and create this creation myth that is based on the decomposition of God and the suffering of matter, and the idea of this kind of movement of the transformation and cyclic nature of life and death. And that was another thing. I never felt that death actually existed after that. It felt like you just kind of, you release your body, but your body is part of one small realm of things, but then there's this whole larger realm that takes you. And I have more specific ideas surrounding that cosmology, but what I did is I made my first film, Begotten, that I wrote when I was 19. I finished it when I was 24. I tried to get people to see it for 2 years. It was like just laughed at and vilified by the New York film, distributors. And then finally, I just sort of said, okay, it'll find its audience one of these days. And finally, I get this phone call from Susan Sontag. I don't know if you guys know who she is, or she passed away a year and a half ago. But she's like this brilliant woman who studied with Bertrand Russell. She was a great humanitarian. She a great writer, a novelist, philosopher, sociologist. She was the one responsible for bringing, Truffaut and Godard's films to America when no one knew who Truffaut or Godard was, and the French New Wave. And she called me up and said, I think your film is a masterpiece. And I asked, and I thought it was a joke, so I thought it was a friend of mine playing a joke on me. So I started to fuck with her, and over the phone. And then it started to dawn on me, like, okay, this person's more intelligent than my friend who would be fucking, and she's sticking to her points pretty clearly and pretty passionately. So, and it's weird because I had read all of her stuff in college, and so finally she says, look, I really want to show your film in my living room. Can you do that? Can you make that happen? And I said, yeah, of course I can. And so I did. I showed it to her, to 20 of her closest friends, and they were all great poets, great writers, great photographers. Annie Leibovitz was there, a photographer that photographs for, Vanity Fair, and has done like the great Rolling Stone covers of the 70s, with John Lennon. And it was just an amazing experience. There's a lot of funny stories that surround that experience, but I'm not going to get into that because I don't have enough time, and I want to get to other important things. But basically, I started getting calls from directors that I've always admired, German directors, French directors, and other artists and painters. And I realized, okay, this is amazing. This is a film that is speaking to great artists that I've always admired, and it has done its purpose. It wound up in the Smithsonian Institute, wound up at the Museum of Modern Art in Vienna, and it barely got it got distributed in New York. It got amazing reviews for such a completely bizarre, strange piece of filmmaking. But in this film, it is this creation myth. And to create this creation myth, I had to build this optical printer that I would then rephotograph every single frame of the film, to create this world. Because I saw this world in my mind's eye, but there was no film, there was no camera, there was no lens that would allow me to actually capture that. And so it became this, the technology was born out of this yearning desire to create this world that I had seen in my head, which kind of mirrored this kind of cosmology of what I wanted to create in the first place. And so the making of that film was very hands-on and very materially, chemically, and optically oriented. And And I found that that film was this incredible teacher of mine, because people would see the film, you know, from all over the world, and they would write to me about Egyptian creation myths, about Mesopotamian, you know, stories, about things that I knew very little about. And all of a sudden it opened up this completely other view that, oh, what I thought was original and was born out of me somehow is really just a mirror of things that for millennia people have been, you know, dealing with these subjects and exploring these subjects as stories, as, you know, as these great pillars of their culture and society. And then I'm going to skip Shadow of the Vampire and move to Suspect Zero. With Suspect Zero, it's a film that I had moved out to LA about 11 years ago, and one of the things that I remember reading, it was like during the summer, like July or August, was this small little article about the declassification of the remote viewing program. And it started to go into a few, there were like 3 or 4 sentences about like what it was, but when I read that, I started thinking like, okay, this is where some serious research by some extraordinary pioneers, I mean, really astronauts of the human mind, were exploring, you know, something fantastic. And I felt like this should be on the front page of the news. It shouldn't be, you know, inside the body of the paper. And then I saw another article that was similarly, I think it was written by the same person, but it was just syndicated, and I found it in another newspaper. And I just felt like this is pretty extraordinary. And so I sort of put that aside, and that was like in the mid-90s. And then years later, when I had gotten this script from Paramount, it was basically a straight-ahead, you know, FBI, you know, profiling story. And so I sent it back, and I said, you know, thank you, but this maybe would have been an interesting film in 1987, but it's not going to be interesting now. You know, audiences are too smart, and there's other things to do that I think are more interesting. And so they were just kind of like nonplussed by this, because they made a big deal about it and the way they presented it. And so then they came back to me and said, well, all right, well, what would you do that would be different? And so I said, well, give me 3 days with it, you know. So I took 3 days with it, and on the 3rd day, I had all this stuff on the wall about, you know, just really breaking down the structure of it. And I was doing some really cool things with the dramatic structure of it. But what I was not doing was I was not finding the heart of what the screenplay needed, what the story needed. And so I was just completely exhausted and really nervous as hell, because the next day was the meeting, you know, at Paramount, and I wanted to have all my ducks lined up, and I didn't have anything lined up, really. I had a lot of interesting story points, but nothing that really was going to galvanize this thing into something extraordinary. So I decided, okay, I'm just going to meditate for 15 minutes, not meditate on the problem, but meditate to just get away from even thinking about the screenplay and anything to do with it. So I meditated for 15 minutes, and after meditating, I just felt so tired, and I just went to sleep. And 35 minutes later, I woke up, and it was instantaneous that this article from years back that I had read, all of a sudden, when, you know, a light bulb went off, and I said, I need to find out about this thing, remote viewing, on a serious level. And I went to the library, the local library, which had a few things, and I just started just devouring everything I can get a hold of, started making notes, and by that night, I just had something that I thought, okay, I really want to see this thing get made. This is cool. And then got Paramount to see, you know, see the same way. So it was really weird going from one day to the next, and the next day sort of like coming off like I was an expert, you know, in remote viewing, you know, like I knew everything about it when I didn't. It was just, I just really just took pieces from here, pieces from there, and just put it together, but very passionately sort of presented it in a way that I felt like, see, to me, real, you know, first of all, I hate serial killer movies, you know, and I don't like a lot of blood in a film, because I think that what is terrifying and what is more interesting is the psychological, is how you perceive things and how you move, and also the trickster nature of perception, where you can move from perceiving something as the devil and as something, just evil, and then with just a sort of shift of perspective, see it as quite harmless and actually possibly helpful in some ways, And so I started to really read everything that I could, and as a matter of fact, reading the books of the brilliant minds that are actually lecturing in this conference, and so that was a real treat for me, because all of a sudden I started to get into that childhood fascination of, the brain, the mind, the mystery of the mind, and then the whole kind of idea that something as conservative as the American military was actually exploring this as a model of of counterintelligence or intelligence gathering, and so it just seemed to me, okay, you have this movement of science and the unexplainable, just kind of moving together into under one roof, and it just seemed to me okay, this is exciting, this is compelling, and that was where I had such a great time, researching it, learning about it, and then after the film was done, it didn't stop there. What I wanted to do is create a documentary that would complement the actual film, a documentary that would actually interview, the real pioneers, the real astronauts of the mind. And so, I interviewed, Russell Targ, I interviewed Paul, I interviewed a number of people, everybody that I could get a hold of, in the community. And I just feel that this is a very important piece of history that people are not paying enough attention to, but I have a different sort of confidence in history and time, that I think in time, just because this seems to be so popular now, in 100 years, a lot of the thises that are so popular now, nobody's going to be thinking about them, and I mean, if you think about Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, I found out it was only published in 270 first editions, and and his mother is the one that paid for the publishing of that book, and yet now it's published across the world in every language, in endless editions. But this is where I'm getting to here with remote viewing. I think that what I've learned, especially talking to, in something that I know Dr. Radin is going to get into this afternoon with entangled minds. I mean, that's something that is on the periphery of all of our vision, but it takes a brilliant mind to just sort of pull it together, turn it into a book, turn it into salient ideas, and the same thing with Russell's books, the same thing about getting a hold of some of Ingo's essays, and then speaking certainly with Paul, there's this sense of something just extraordinary that people can't, that I'm saying that the general populace just cannot handle, because people can't handle it in a certain way, because so much of us are dominated by our senses, dominated by what we can see, feel, and touch. But the fact of the matter is that remote viewing represents another sense that is just as biological and just as part of our humanity as our eyes are or our ears. And but it's just that fear that always takes place before an evolutionary pattern begins to take place, And I think that the world, in the state of contraction that it is in, both, philosophically, politically, religiously, I mean, across the board, that in that state of contraction, it's almost like it has to give birth. And I have a very positive view that some great things are going to come out in the next few years. But the most important thing is that like conferences like this exist, that great minds do come together and do listen to one another and do collaborate. And because that's what it's all about. It's about collaboration. It's not about one person being a genius or being great. It's about a group of people really in a fraternal way, really just finding something that everybody's working together. It's not about the money or about the press or about who's going to love you or who's going to hate you. You know, I mean, if I started thinking about that, you know, I would have just stopped. I would have never made movies. You know, I would have never after my first film, you know, I would have never made another film. And the fact is that you're planting a seed over time by having this convention, by having these conversations, and that seed is going to grow, and that is what is most important. And the thing that you notice in the world is that it seems to be always the knuckleheads that have these extraordinary organizational skills, because they're not dealing with, you know, infinite possibilities. You know, they're just saying, you know, they're just going ones and zeros and going, oh, well, is it a one or is it a zero? Oh, it's a one. All right, let's go. You know, and you know, for all of us, it's not ones and zeros. There's something behind the zero, and there's 100 billion zeros and 100 billion ones, and the way they combine with each other is infinite. And you know, in understanding that sounds like we're waffling. You know, like we're wafflers. You know, but it's not that at all. We're thinkers, and we have that deep sensitivity and connectivity to, you know, cosmically what it is all about. And now, you know, something that I'm working on right now is that Turner Classic Movies has tapped the shoulders of like 6 or 7 film directors to come up with, you know, whatever. They give you a small amount of money, and they say, the bad news is we're giving you a small amount of money, but we're giving everybody the same amount of money. And, you know, but the good news is you do whatever the heck you want. And so what I've done is, you know, at first I went the conventional route with, you know, working with producers and people that I know, you know, in Hollywood that can help me out with special effects, with photography, with this and that. And basically they all started freaking out with the idea of what I wanted to do because they didn't know how to do it. And so what I've done is I've sort of turned now to my best friends who aren't even in the film industry, who are artists, who are painters, you know, who are sculptors. And now I'm making these miniature sets, these painted backdrops. There's 2 lenses that I built in the last 5 years that I'm employing and using. I'm using a still camera from 1903, you know, and I'm also using, and my friend is an astrophysicist at UC Santa Barbara, and he's helping develop this vision program that allows you to see spectrums of the light spectrum. No, wait. Light that you cannot see with the human eye in the light spectrum becomes visible in this program. So, and then the story that I was interested in is I started thinking to myself, like, what is it that I would really love to just see and dramatize for other people? And the idea was that, going back to that first thing that I was talking about, this idea of this abyss, this idea before the Big Bang, this idea before the Big Bang and before form, before anything existed, and that movement of that energy, almost like a lightning, like a scalpel of lightning, just cutting across that blackness and just giving birth, and this kind of reaching of form, you know, desiring to just sort of build itself into a bridge between this kind of blackness and wakefulness and consciousness. So this is the story that I'm and I can say that though I was inspired philosophically by that when I was younger, I feel that my experience with remote viewing has made me think in terms of storytelling, that this whole linear form of storytelling is just so boring to me. You know, it just feels like that the power and the potential of the cinema has not even been reached or even close to being reached. And so now I want to explore those moments. If you look at, Lawrence of Arabia, you have this epic where you follow this man's life from beginnings to the conquest of the Middle East and coming back, a drunk and sort of disappointed and disillusioned, but still a hero nonetheless. And to me, I'm thinking more in terms of the epic as that moment, that split second between where nothing exists and something starts to happen. And that infinite gulf that separates those two spaces, that to me is epic. And it's happening all the time. We're constantly, regenerating ourselves, our cells, on a cellular level. It's happening mentally. It's happening as I speak to you and you're thinking. It's happening as I'm talking, because what I'm saying is actually coming from you guys. There's a certain thing where you get inspired by your audience. You're not just isolated. We're all sponges. We all, and that's why if we're around people that understand us and can amplify us, it is so much better than being around people that just don't understand what the hell you're talking about and just sort of take. Because then you don't have that sonar. You don't have that way of because so much of creation and creativity, but the way nature works is about like sending out that seed coming back, and this kind of dialectic that begins to occur between these two things, creating a third idea, always creating that third magical idea. And so in this film, which is called The Din of Celestial Birds, it really explores this kind of new experiment in storytelling and how successful or unsuccessful it's going to be. I've never been more excited in my life, making something, because I just feel like there is something really powerful here, and I really think that I can develop this into something that gets at the homeopathic nature and power of the image. We've all seen mandalas, we've all seen, sacred images, and we understand, and we've all worked with symbols at some point. You work with it in remote viewing when, you're just sitting there and you're drawing these kind of iconic pictures that are very simple, but it goes back to that space in the brain between, almost like that liminal gate, as I understand it, between this kind of unconscious and the conscious. And I've also found that the Jungian model doesn't entirely work, in terms of the cosmology that I feel is truer to what is really going on. I find that deep appreciation of Jung, read most of his stuff, almost all of it, and but I still feel that it's too convenient and too categorical, and the way the mind works and the way nature works has these other components that are closer to, quantum ways of thinking, closer to fractal formation and building. And so, with all of that said, I want to show the first couple of parts of the documentary that is on the DVD for Suspect Zero. And I think it's important because what it does is that you have people like, Ben Kingsley and my actors in the film talking and thinking about remote viewing. So in a way, even though the film was not a success theatrically, it still has planted a seed. And the fact is that more and more people are renting the film, and more people are interested in the film. And I think that success is not something that is immediate, it's something that occurs through time. Let me get off the podium.
help me turn it off. Nobody's told us how to turn it off, and you're gonna help me turn it off.
In 1995-96, when remote viewing was declassified, I read an article in the New York Times and I read an article in the LA Times. It's just a small article talking about this program that had been secret for 20 years, that millions of dollars had been sunk into by the intelligence community. They were using psychics and physicists to deconstruct how the mind behaves psychically.
The thrust of science has been to look at things in mechanical ways and figure out how the sticks and balls sort of piece each other together. And we build up the idea about how the brain works as essentially a mechanical computer. And there's nothing particularly wrong with that idea. It actually does account for a lot of what we see in terms of our behavior and awareness. The problem is that things like psychic phenomena don't fit in very well.
We are more than our physical bodies. That is clearly evident. You know, someday maybe we'll define physicality as being much broader than we do now, but given today's understanding of what it means to be physical, we are clearly more than our physical bodies. We are able to perceive, conceive, understand, conceptualize, and accurately report on things that if we were limited to our physical bodies and our minds were limited to our brains, that we would not be able to do, and yet we can do it. So that tells me right there that the game is far different than is conventionally believed in our society.
For thousands of years, cultures across the globe have all explored perception that goes beyond our five senses. A multitude of ancient cultures have all asked the question, from where does consciousness arise from?
你比如西方认为呢，像这种意念思维是出自大脑的。
The Westerner believe the mind is basically come from the brain.
但是在东亚在亚洲东亚，尤其以中国为主的受这种传统道教思想影响的，那我们认为除了大脑之外，是参加了有心脏的这个器官，因为它有这个神智和思维活动的参与。
Mostly like Oriental people or Chinese people, they have the background of the Taoists. They believe the mind is not only coming from the brain, it also came from the heart.
它是这两种的结合。
The mind is a combination of the brain and heart.
What are these?
With those numbers and pictures, he said he could find anybody.
Not many people know what remote viewing is. It's a science that these guys have developed to pick information out of the ether and put it on paper to catch the bad guys. And my skills as an agent, my intuitiveness, and my kind of soulfulness helped me to tap into the serial killer's specialized art of remote viewing. I guess I use my five senses to catch the bad guys.
I can't pretend to understand remote viewing any more than I could play chess for Searching for Bobby Fischer very well for 8 weeks we were shooting, but I can't move chess on the chessboard now. But Orion is a remote viewer. It enables him to empathize on an extraordinary level with other human beings.
The secret about remote viewing is that there is no secret. Remote viewing is a natural ability. People can learn it readily.
In fact, I was in the remote viewing program. I was trained. I'd never had a psychic experience before in my life. I'd never done anything like this. They taught me how to do it.
In fact, you could say we were the X-Files. We were the people actually supported by the whole intelligence community during the Cold War to provide information that could not be obtained in any other way.
Target reference number 17446, go.
My take on remote viewing is that it's a technical
exercise in developing the ability to see, to have a sense of seeing into the minds of other people and into the future or into a particular case. It could be compared to being psychic. I totally believe that that's possible, that there is something beyond us, that our minds are, that we're using like this much of our capacity to see and be. So this is kind of like an out there extreme idea, but I believe it. I believe that's completely possible.
What is remote viewing? It's the ability to perceive and describe a target that is separated from you either by distance, by some kind of shielding, or by time. So in other words, you do not have what we would consider normal perceptual access to that target. You can't see, smell, taste, touch, or feel the target. You don't have any technical means like television or radio to connect you with that. You have no way of knowing what the target is by what we would consider conventional means.
You ever heard of a project called Icarus?
No.
Have you?
No.
It's agents trained to see distant locations using nothing but the mind. They call it remote viewing. Army stole it from the Soviets, Bureau stole it from the Army. They use it to track down serial killers.
For a decade, I had the opportunity to sit in the dark in a electrically shielded room with whoever the psychic of the day was. I had a job to function as a kind of psychic travel agent where I would help the visitor with me to describe and experience what was happening in a distant place.
One target at a time.
Remote viewing caters principally to the non-analytical part, where we describe shapes and forms and feelings of psychic content. So a remote viewer can describe the shape and the form and the outline and the material and the color and his feelings about a remote viewing target or target site. He's very unlikely to be able to name the object.
The whole point of remote viewing was to provide a structured technique around clairvoyance to try to make it more repeatable and to be able to teach people how to do it.
The reason you men are sitting here is because you all fit into the personality profile that best suits a remote viewer.
We are very confident that our work was just what we claim it to be, that people can learn to quiet their mind and expand their awareness and describe and experience what's happening in a distant place.
This girl is afraid. She's afraid. Afraid.
You start off when you do a remote viewing session according to this controlled remote viewing methodology by just getting a very bare, basic, fundamental notion of what the target is. Structure, land, water. Just a quick flash.
So that if you're doing a remote viewing, we encourage people to describe out loud and draw the very initial fragments that come to them, even though they don't make any sense, because we know that those initial fragments are frequently the most telling and reliable elements of a remote viewing activity.
Then you perceive the sensory elements to it, the smells, the tastes, the textures, the temperatures, the sounds, the colors, the shading, the qualities of light and interplays of light, and then shapes and the dimensional qualities. And then as you proceed, things get more and more complex and you start adding abstract notions.
The thing that inhibited remote viewing is a great desire to be right. In order to do remote viewing, you have to be willing to be wrong, and you have to give up the strong human desire to name the object.
The idea is normal perception, of course. The brain doesn't see a red rubber ball, it doesn't see a car, it doesn't see a building. I'm sorry, we don't see those things. The brain puts those together when all of our senses report to it. What we see, and I'll use the red rubber ball, what we see are patterns of light and dark and different wavelengths of color. That's what comes into our eyes, goes down our optic nerve, and end up in the visual cortex. Colors, shades, edges, those are the kinds of things that get reported by our senses. Further reported, of course, is the sponginess and the texture and all that kind of thing, but they come in fragments. And in remote viewing, that's what you first get, are those elementary bits of perception. If a red rubber ball were the target, a remote viewer initially would get perhaps red, shaded, smooth, spongy. And then as enough information comes in, a concept starts to build in the brain. And eventually then, of course, the analytic function of the brain, the left hemisphere that does a lot of the conclusion drawing from the senses come in, finally may come to the conclusion, oh, it's a red rubber ball.
A viewer has a tendency, once she latches onto something, if I say, can you describe this target site, you may say, there's a beautiful daffodil there, I see it clearly, and the viewer at that point is done because he has had the experience of seeing something in the distance. It's the interviewer's job to say, okay, thank you for the daffodil, we've got that. What else is happening here? The CIA is not actually interested in the daffodil, but thank you very much. What are they doing in the building? What's the bigger picture? Can you look down from above and make a plan view drawing of this place? So the interviewer is very much a psychic travel agent, and the viewer has this omniscient capability to expand his awareness through space and through time and describe what exists and what's happening anywhere in the world.
So, I mean, I show that to you guys because it is significant that a documentary is created, made, and is accompanying a DVD, a movie that is released by Paramount and does get out there into the world. So this is out there, and a lot of people are seeing it. Now, how it manifests itself and the manifestation of that awareness, is something yet to be seen or felt, but it is there. And the idea that you have actors talking about remote viewing, you start to build a bridge. It's the beginning of a bridge of synthesis of people seriously talking about this stuff. And it was important to me in this documentary to mix the real pioneers, the real brilliant minds behind the program. And I mean, it's not, you didn't see the whole documentary. There's a few more parts to it. And Jessica is on there as well. And it's just great. There's some great stuff in there. And what's important is that it really, I wanted to show, these pioneers with, actors, and it just somehow the synthesis of all of that, I think, is creating a pattern that will then become easier and easier and more understood, within the larger community, because it's like issues of consciousness, issues of expansion, is really what's going to save us as a civilization. And these are the things that are the most important. And it just seems like it looks like when you read the newspapers that the arts and philosophy and research into the mind seems like something that is just passé and not important with all the important stuff that is going on, over in Iraq or in the Middle East. But that's not true. And the fact is that this is why I'm encouraging, and this is why I'm here. I'm here because I like, and it's important to me to see collaboration taking place between different disciplines and different forms of expression. That there are some magnificent books that are for sale here, on remote viewing, but that there are films, that there are documentaries, that there are, people coming together and figuring out the puzzle to, just working together, and working together is the key to success, because it's always that tribe that works together that finds, health and vitality and culture as its kind of gifts. And with that, I'll take questions.
Can we have people step up to that microphone in the middle there if you want to speak, so we can get it down on tape?
Uh-oh.
Thank you very much for joining us. An exciting, intelligent film. Could you share your comments why it was not more successful at the box office?
Yeah. Well, there was a discussion I was actually having earlier where you have, I think that the problem at the box office was three things. One of them was the fact that in the end, I don't think, the studio was very supportive, but they didn't really understand how to get the picture out there. And I think that a lot more groundwork needed to be done in terms of getting the public more aware of the film. Not of the film, but of remote viewing. And I think that the credibility of remote viewing was very important to the distribution of this film. That somehow there needed to be, whether it was getting Diane Sawyer to remote view, live, or not live, but just taped, and making that authentic, or some journalist. I think it was important to get that kind of education and that kind of consciousness going, in the audience at least 6 months in advance of the release of the film, because the problem was that people thought remote viewing was something that I invented. Most of the journalists thought that this is some cockamamie Hollywood, farce, in terms of what remote viewing actually is, and something like the documentary that I put together with you guys, was something that should have been maybe released, beforehand, in different networks, So, I had a plan, but, you don't always get everything you want. So what was important to me is, it was sort of like the message in the bottle was, okay, let's put the film together with this documentary and, and just get as much information in there as possible, make it as interesting as possible, and just let's see where it takes us, in the next couple of years, But I also think that, we live, I also think that there's an aspect of the film where it's not violent or bloody enough for a certain segment of the population, and yet it's too terrifying for another segment of the population. So it sort of falls kind of right in the middle. And but I am encouraged. I'm also an idealist, so you can just dismiss what I'm about to say. That I am encouraged by the fact that there has been an increase of the frequency of people looking at the DVD, and that it has been on pay-per-view, it has been, on Starz Network, and that the film is getting out there. But I think that it's something that maybe years from now will be appreciated for, for what it is as a film, but also for what it is introducing in terms of remote viewing, because it was very important to me in the way remote viewing was portrayed, that it was portrayed as a serious, kind of rigorous discipline, and not just some flighty, sort of airy-fairy kind of thing,
First of all, I want to thank you for accepting the invitation to be here. It's really great to have you. I saw the movie, when it first came out in the theater, and unfortunately, of course, we saw just the movie, not those great extras that you added. That was truly magnificent. I think I'm going to have to buy the movie just for those. But now let me throw a little bit of a stone here.
Please. That's what
the one thing that troubled me a little about the movie is the impression that it might leave regarding remote viewing. I do remember in Jim Schnabel's book on remote viewers, there was at least one remote viewer who did end up going to the psycho ward, maybe as a result of problems that he was having dealing with remote viewing, and I think there were maybe personal problems too. But for the most part, it seems as though remote viewers are very healthy and happy, and they went about their work. I think Lynn Buchanan's book, In the Seventh Sense, he talks a little bit about the necessity of isolation, though, where they really did have to isolate themselves because of this business of not wanting to read the newspaper because it might end up affecting the quality of the remote viewing, and so that would have its effect. The other thing, as I've thought my way through this, is remote viewers were not remote viewing murders every day, which might actually lead to, you know, someone going off the deep end. But I just didn't, I had a little problem with that connection between going nuts, which people already think that we are, you know, and the movie, which then might have fed into that.
Well, you know, Tarek already, you know, grabbed me and pulled me into a dark alley last night and beat me up over that. And it's actually a very important point that I do respect. But from my point of view, that my impression of the program, I'm talking now about Stargate, is that you had these pioneers, these astronauts that went out there to the far reaches, you know, of things, and then all of a sudden it was just dismantled and there just seemed to be no support system, no more research, nothing. So to me the metaphor that's happening here in the film is that you have that, you know, the message is genius and pioneering intent that is unsupported and abandoned leads to madness and leads to unfortunate things. And so what it really is it's a kind of, it's a different way of expressing what you're talking about, you know. And it wasn't to sensationalize remote viewing or to make it, you know, something that, you know, leads to madness. That's not the case at all. I just wanted, you know, it was more of a statement about, you know, the artist, the scientists, the researchers, the people that really are, you know, evolving the world and supporting them properly. Because it just seemed to me a very sad kind of shame that the program was just declassified and dismantled, and, you know, and it just seems to me that the program is something that, and this kind of research, we should be throwing money at that. I mean, with the cost of what the Iraqi war is costing us every day, a fraction of that would give, you know, Dean Radin the equipment that he needs, you know, Russell, you know, I mean, all of you guys, you know, an ability to really explore stuff that would make front page news, that would be something worthy of, you know, of the soaring human spirit and what it's capable of, you know. And I think that that's the positive message, but the negative message is that, you know, the government, or not the government, forget the government, but the funding, like for even this conference, you know, is something that just came purely out of the passion of just a few people, you know, and did not come out of society. It did not come out of, you know, a desire for research, a desire for forward-moving knowledge. So, you know, you end up with a Benjamin Orion when you have that lack of support and that isolation, and you have that kind of a gift. So I feel that the film is the integrity of what I'm doing with remote viewing is I'm making a parable about what happens when a really great thing is abandoned.
Thank you, Elias. I think we're out of time. I'm sorry. I don't want to cut too deep into the lunch hour. Thank you for your interest, your passion.
Thank you.
I'd like to say that the film was one of the most frequently pirated ones in Kuwait. You could buy it in any corner. It's kind of a backhand compliment. And I'd like to just correct one thing. Nobody in the project ever went crazy. The person who, well, they came crazy, but the one person who did have a mental breakdown was going through an institute. It wasn't part of the project, but because it involved human use, which falls under DoD regs, they put him under the project while he was kind of all the INSCOM headquarters personnel were going through this project. And while he was there, because of some problems he was having at home, he went a little bonkers. And we get blamed for that constantly, but nobody ever went insane. If some people came insane, stayed insane, and left insane, but yeah, they were still functionally insane, yes. Thank you very much.